Well, today we have Phil Horan from the Harmony Homeowners Association, and we're incredibly happy to have him talk a little bit about his residential community and give us a snapshot into how things work on the ground. So, Phil, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Good. Excellent. Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you. So, Phil, I think we can go ahead and start with you just giving a snapshot of your background and Harmony and give us a sense about how that community works and what your relationship is to its management.
Yep. Excellent. So yeah, Phil Horan. I'm currently the president of the Harmony Grove Homeowners Association. So we're a community in Naperville, Illinois, about 30 miles west of Chicago. Just to give you a frame of reference, city of Naperville is about 160,000 people or so. Our community itself has about 385 homes. We've been around, I think initial development was about 25 years ago or so. And we're a self-managed HOA association. So we don't use a management company. We just have a board of directors. There's 7 of us that are on the board. And usually we sign up for terms of about 3 years for each board member. So I've been currently in this role about 3.5 years as the president of the association.
Excellent. Now, as far as the self-management system goes, we've talked with several HOA management companies, which are usually involved with several different communities, in many cases, even in the hundreds across, in some cases, several states. So for your community, you guys being self-governed, how, in your mind, is that, how does that work in practice? And, how do you find that experience as the president of a self-managed HOA?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So our subdivision, we don't have any amenities like clubhouse, pool, anything like that. So really the bulk of our management is around landscaping. So we have a big fence that goes around our subdivision, have some common areas that we landscape and maintain. But our HOA dues are pretty low. A year, it's $225 a year for each home. So it's a budget of less than 100,000 a year. For those reasons, I think are one of the main reasons we chose to self-manage versus using a management company is the fees would go up quite a bit to use a management company. And because we don't have any facilities, I think initially they decided, let's try this, get our own board of directors set up and manage it through our own efforts. We do employ a law firm that's very familiar with HOAs in general here locally in Naperville. And we periodically will ping them if we have questions that kind of go beyond our capabilities as an independent HOA board of directors. So we'll use them for things when, you have homeowners that are very past due on dues. We've used them a couple times to help us in that regards. We've changed our covenants a couple times. And we've utilized them to help us in that process and guide us a little bit. A lot of times you kind of get that service with a management company sometimes. So that's sort of like a in between that we chose where we're employing people as we need them, but we're trying to manage on our own.
I see. So because you guys don't have all of this infrastructure, for lack of a better word, as far as the amenities are concerned, you can keep the costs low and there isn't really a need for, all year round active management from a company like that. But when you have the need for it, you can basically bring that on board to solve the problem.
Yeah, that's where the legal company comes in, and it's been very helpful for us because on our board we actually don't have anyone that is a lawyer. So legal to make sure we do things right, will often leverage their expertise in that. So that's been really good and really allowed us to continue as a self-managed organization.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Now, as far as Harmony Grove goes, how big is the community, would you say?
Yeah, it's 386 homes. So again, a budget of less than 100 grand a year, with each home paying 225 a year. And just for like frame of reference from that budget standpoint, probably about 70% of it goes to landscaping. So we have a big fence that surrounds our subdivision that we replace I think we budget for every 15 years to replace the fence. So that's kind of a reserve that we have going. And then the rest of it is we have an entrance that has some landscaping, lighting, signage, et cetera. So that 70% of the budget is to sort of manage that area.
Understood. When we speak to planned communities, one thing that they often pride themselves on is that community aspect. In other words, they differentiate themselves from your average suburban neighborhood or what have you by the fact that they have common ground or they have experiences and events. Usually these are tied to the amenities we're talking about, but that's really a kind of a source of pride for these communities to establish themselves as something unique, that's actually grounded in a real community. So with respect to your model at Harmony Grove, how would you say, or would you say that the community can still and does still come together, and on common ground and like actively participates in events with one another? Do you guys have that component?
Yeah, we do. We try, it's been harder with COVID over the last couple of years. Obviously that the face-to-face stuff got put on pause, but we'll do things like, Easter egg hunt, to have kids. There is a park that's on the edge of our subdivision. So we'll utilize, and you can rent it from the city. So we'll do a lot of stuff there. We do a July 4th parade where we bring, kind of a big fire truck into the subdivision, drives around. They do a little parade for the kids. So stuff like that, stuff with the Christmas lighting. One of the things that our HOA has chosen from the very beginning to really emphasize is having homes participate in lighting up their parkway trees. So it makes the subdivision really cool to drive through it during Christmas. So we try and do different events. Over the years, we've had a social committee. I'm not actually a board member, but someone that works with the board that will run some social events. Things like, going bowling as a homeowners association, top golf, stuff like that. We try and sprinkle those in, and we get pretty good participation from the residents within the association.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned COVID too, because I definitely want to drill into some of the effects of COVID and get a sense for how they've affected Harmony Grove in the short term, but also in the long term. One trend that has gotten a lot of exposure and is something that we've talked about with some other guests is the kind of drive for migration from more dense urban cities and environments, especially along the east and west coasts, into a more suburban, even more rural communities in the interior of the U.S. We've spoken to a couple of planned communities in Texas, specifically in the Austin area. And for them, while in the short term, COVID was really tough, as it has been for many of us, it has driven a lot of migration to their communities over the course of the last couple of years. So I'm curious to hear from you how since COVID has progressed and some of the lockdowns and whatnot are no longer in effect, have you found an increase in interest in Harmony Grove as a result of COVID, or some of its other effects?
Yeah, definitely. So we're a suburb of Chicago, about 30 miles west of Chicago. So we definitely have seen, for a lot of different reasons, COVID, work from home. There's a lot of people leaving the city of Chicago for safety reasons, different things that have gone on recently. So suburbs are becoming very, very popular. People growing up with families, they want yards, so suburbs have definitely, price increased quite a bit over the last year to 2 years. So one of the interesting effects that I've seen from a board member perspective from all that is not only the increased interest and more homes are buying and selling, but when you have more people working from home, we've seen a definite increase in, we have a covenant, policies within our subdivision to try and maintain certain basic things for homes, landscaping, just general noise, et cetera. We've definitely seen an increase in people reaching out, for lack of a better term, they'll complain about something doesn't look right with another particular neighbor. When everyone's at home, we definitely saw a big increase in that activity. So that, something to keep in mind with any sort of HOA in a suburb nowadays, you're going to see many more people at home, which anytime you have more eyes on properties all day, you tend to have a lot more activity of emails coming to the HOA asking questions.
No doubt. And another big topic on everyone's mind, especially at the moment, is the state of the housing market. A lot of people are hoping that things will kind of stabilize over the summer. Do you have any thoughts based on what you've seen over the last 2 or 3 years in your position as president? How has that really affected Harmony Grove?
Yeah, obviously the activity volume is increased quite a bit, as I mentioned, with homes, suburbs being popular. Some of the things that we've seen come up a little bit more often is rental policies within the subdivision on a couple fronts. Number one, if you go back about 4 years in our subdivision, we did not have any leasing restrictions in our covenants. And we had an issue where someone was short-term rentaling it on Airbnb, and they held a bunch of parties there, and we couldn't really do anything about it, and discovered we really had a hole in our covenants that we didn't have any policies in place as far as like rental restrictions. So we went through a big process to change our covenants and put in a 1-year minimum lease in the subdivision. So now if someone rents a home, there's a minimum 1-year lease and they have to send us a copy, et cetera. Since that time, the city that we are, Naperville, Illinois, has also employed some restrictions, not as much as we have. Ours is a year. I think theirs is less, not quite a year. I think it's 6 months. But that's one area that we've seen come up, as people have moved. We're somewhat of a transitory area where you have a lot of job switching going on. So sometimes people will keep homes for rental. So we just have to, as a board, we just have to keep a list and just kind of keep track of that. Because whenever you have a rental, one of the common issues that comes up is the renter doesn't take care of the yard as much. So you get calls for stuff like that.
What did that process look like? You mentioned that it was lengthy to adjust the covenant to make those changes as far as establishing a year minimum. How how does that process work from your standpoint, and how long did it take?
Yeah, it probably took about 4 to 5 months to get it done. One of the things we discovered in our covenants was how difficult it was to actually make a change in the covenants. And by that, I mean, you had to get a very high percentage of signatures to change anything in the covenants. And that was just something that was written in the original covenants when the subdivision was built, and no one changed it. So we had to, work with our legal firm that we contract with to kind of help us manage, what do we have to get? And one of the problems was not just getting signatures, but you have to verify that that person owns that home. And so there's a whole legal process that you have to go through to verify all that. And our covenants required certified letters to go to each home. So it was just a lot more steps that we had to go through to make a pretty simple change in the covenants. It was all because of the rules. So I would say as you set up new HOAs, that's one thing to definitely pay close attention to, is what are the steps that as a board you have to go through to make a change in the covenants. Using stuff like certified mail in the verbiage is not recommended, because that just adds a lot of time to that process.
Yeah, definitely. Being a self-managed HOA, I can imagine that there's quite a bit of information you guys have to process with respect to fees and permits and so on. How do you guys keep track of everything? Because for a management company, there are various software platforms and different tools that are designed for use in broad swaths of planned community operations. Do you guys use something like that?
Yeah, well, we kind of lean on our legal firm for that. As I mentioned, they work with hundreds of HOAs. So they'll often reach out to us. I'm trying to think of another example, but every now and then they'll reach out to us and say, hey, like solar panels was a good example. We didn't have anything in our covenants about solar panels. Do we allow them? Should we put in some restrictions about them? they kind of helped us draft a change that we added to our covenants, and it related to solar panels. So we kind of relied on them to give us some standard verbiage that we could use. So that's probably the number one resource that we have to help us kind of keep in tune with new stuff that's going on. So we meet with them at least once a year just to talk over things and see if there's new topics we need to focus on. We also subscribe to a couple different newsletters that are, I think, national regarding homeowners associations. And they have some good topics in there that all of our board members will kind of review. It's like a quarterly newsletter. And that can sometimes be helpful to kind of nip something in the bud that we see might be coming that we haven't addressed yet.
So as far as you mentioned it a little bit earlier on regarding the types of people moving into the community, living in the community. Do you find that the kind of core demographic is mostly young families who are moving from places like Chicago into a more suburban environment, or more of a mix, young and old? What does that kind of distribution look like for Harmony Grove?
Yeah, for us, I think you see, so we're a part of the Naperville School District, and they have really, really strong, very good schools. So you definitely see in our subdivision a lot of people wanting to move to this area for a specific school district, which we are in. And for that reason, we see a lot of families, various ages, but generally the type of turnover that's very common here is someone will move in with young families, and like what I'm experiencing as my kids have gotten older, they're out in the working world, we may move from the subdivision. We don't necessarily care as much about the school district anymore, but for us, we see a lot of movement into the subdivision with young families, for sure.
And I imagine one of the big draws is the school system, having good access to good schools, and that's something I think you guys mentioned on your website as being one of the kind of pillars of Harmony Grove is, elementary school nearby, good middle school, good high school.
Yeah, so we don't have the elementary schools on the edge right outside our subdivision, but it's like within a mile. So
Okay.
it's actually walkable if you live in the subdivision. There's many families that will walk their kids to the elementary as if they're older in the elementary school. So that's a nice plus. And then, yeah, the middle school is very close by. High school's right up the street. It's a really, really good school district. So that definitely draws people specifically looking for homes in a particular district.
Now, as far as because I know that with your model, you've served as president for or within the last 3 years. How often is there turnaround with respect to the management of the board? Do you find people are mostly there just serving one term and then they're moving out, or how long do people typically sit on the board, and how does that really work in practice from your perspective?
Yeah, it varies a little bit. I'm in my second term, but I'm going to be moving out of the subdivision, so we'll be transitioning to a new president here pretty soon. I'd say and then before me, the rest of us on the board, there's 7 of us. We do 3-year terms, and we try and stagger them so that everyone's not turning over the same year. So no more than 2 people turn over within a year. That helps from a transition standpoint. And when we also try and not have like the president and the vice president turn over the same year, we try and alter those so that, again, if there is some turnover, that it makes the transition easier. But sometimes, you'll have a board member that will stay a couple terms. We had that happen in the beginning when the subdivision was first built. Then you had families that, again, as kids grow and families move on, 1 to 2 terms is very common. I'd say 1 being the most common, 3-year term.
Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, but are people nominated to serve on the board from existing board members, or is there some kind of voting process?
Yep, our voting process is the members of the current board vote in new members of the board. Residents can, put their names in the hat, and then we have, a session where we'll meet and present all the different people if there's multiple people that want to join, and then the board votes on the new boards of directors.
Okay. Yeah, gotcha.
So we don't need the residents to vote on changes to the board. The board's making those votes.
Makes sense.
It's pretty simple. We just do 2/3, has to be 2/3 of the existing board to, get something passed.
Now, I want to talk a little bit as well about the future of Harmony Grove. So, when you guys were first founded and developed, was it the entire subdivision was built out all at once, or was it done more piecemeal over the course of
Yeah,
the history of the project?
there were 2 phases of the subdivision, or there actually might have been 3 phases. So they overlapped all a little bit, but I think they broke it into 3 phases initially.
And the reason I ask is because I'm curious. We found that a lot of these of similar style, similar sized planned communities, similar sized planned communities are experiencing new developments as a result of increased demand, increased volume. So does Harmony Grove expect to grow at all, and kind of bring in more another phase of development?
No. So we were initially, when we were set up, we're kind of landlocked. So there's no additional expansion capability on any side of the subdivision. So I wouldn't anticipate any growth unless we merged with another HOA. That's the only way that would happen.
Interesting. Do you have any experience with something like that? Have you seen that happen
I have
between
not.
HOAs?
No, I've only seen it turn over from, like, when our subdivision was initially built, the developer, manages the HOA, and then once it's fully built out, turns it over to an independent board of directors that gets voted in, and then they move out of the picture.
All right, I see.
So I lived in the subdivision when it was still managed by the developer.
Mhm.
So I've been here I've been here since the beginning, and it was just that, at that point, an initial board was voted in, and then they dropped out of the picture from there.
All right. Well, I want to pass over to Michelle to see if she has any questions for you, Phil.
Sure.
Michelle, do you have anything you'd like to ask?
I'm curious about, like, what do you feel is different from the administration or the management of planned communities in the US from the planned communities in every other part of the world? I don't know if you have the chance to maybe reach out to other planned communities outside the US, or how have been your experience in this matter?
I don't really have a lot of personal experience from outside the US. I would say, just other communities in the US that I've seen and dealt with. I think for us, some of the things that we often think about as a board, and every HOA probably deals with, is, really sort of stepping back and trying to figure out, like, how are you going to manage the community? Are you going to be really strict and have all these really, really strict covenants about landscaping and colors? And, you can see some subdivisions that have very stringent guidelines on stuff like that. And what we've chosen to do as an HOA is not go that route and sort of go in between. We want our subdivision to look nice, and there are some minimums that we sort of, kind of have homes that have to live by, but we don't want it to be so restrictive that people get upset about it. And it's a fine line, because you're always going to try and toe that line of, you may have to push them a little bit and they're not going to be happy with it, but you want to keep, a uniform look of the subdivision, because it makes a difference for property values, and everyone's owning their home. It's, one of their biggest assets. So that's part of the, job of the HOA a little bit, is, keep that uniformity, and hopefully that helps with the value of the homes for each resident.
What do you think it is the main important aspect about a planned communities? Like, when do you think a planned communities reach their objective? It is about, the community, or it is about expansion? The greater, the best?
I'm not sure. I'll attempt to answer. I think, for us, with a community of about 380 homes, again, dues of about $225 a year, pretty low. We're trying to balance is keeping a good uniform look of the subdivision. So our subdivision looks nice, it's desirable, people want to move into it. But at the same time, we don't want to put too much of a burden on the residents of, like, over restrictive covenants putting rules in that, like for a good example is, we have some rules on fences for our subdivision. So, there are some, we have some height restrictions, types of fences, because if you don't have that, what you'll often have is just fences all over the place. They don't look good, they don't look uniform, etc. So you're trying to balance that, keeping a uniform good look with not being too over crazy on those sort of regulations. I think that's personally one of the hardest things if you're a new HOA is like, how do you set that up and what do you set as the minimums and kind of where do you stop? Because you can keep going. Like I'm looking, for example, at a subdivision in South Carolina. It's much more restrictive in their community, but they have lots of amenities, but they're much more restrictive about what you can and can't do without HOA approval. So it's just something that each resident has to be aware of.
Yeah, there's like a trade-off between more active management being more streamlined on the amenity side versus lower regulations, lower costs from the perspective of the resident.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that we've gone back and forth with that you mentioned kind of earlier in the in our discussion was management companies, using a management company to help your HOA. We've almost gone to it a couple times because as a volunteer board that all of us have jobs, we don't have a ton of time to manage the HOA with. It's something we struggled with as we had bigger issues come up. We realized our kind of expertise has a limit and we do need to lean on some partners. We were lucky and I think found the law firm that really sort of bridged that gap for us. But I think that's what an HOA also needs to look at early on is, whether you want to use a management company. There's a lot of advantages to using them because they take care of all the payments, looking at legal stuff. They have legal partners that they can leverage so that you don't have to worry about that stuff. And then you're more concentrating on sort of looking at the big picture. So I think that's a big decision for any HOA is how do you do it yourself or do you leverage a management company for that sort of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that we were curious about as we speak to representatives like yourself from various planned communities is this trend of people looking for more community, really, capital C, in their life. With the development of technology and then the pandemic, which was very isolating for lots of people, I think it's fair to say that people are a little bit more atomized socially than in generations past and years past. And so as people get older, as they start families, they really search for that community aspect in their lives, to ground themselves in a place that with other people with similar views, values, similar like place in their life. And so, as that trend evolves, I think that planned communities will certainly stand to gain and grow and also evolve from that interest. And, as we touched upon, and as you mentioned, COVID was a really big boost for that. And we're very interested in seeing how that trend expands as we go forward. So it's been good to hear from you, Phil, with respect to how that has been evolving in the context of Harmony Grove. And I'd like to ask maybe on a closing note here on that on the topic of that trend, what do you see perhaps from your standpoint? How do you see that evolving, perhaps from your own examples, but also just zooming out a bit? What are your thoughts on that trend overall and how it's affecting planned communities in general?
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think you're seeing, when you're talking about people moving out of big cities to suburbs, one of the natural tendencies there is, they're looking for a community to have, from a social standpoint. So I do think that, in my opinion, I have kids that are younger out in the working world, and they're often looking for subdivisions, apartment complexes. They're always looking for amenities, like people in that, whatever the development is, whether it's apartment complex or development. So I do think that trend definitely is going that way. We're a subdivision with with no amenities like clubhouse, pool, etc. I do think those types of subdivisions, I can see them becoming a little more popular because you have facilities to congregate at rather than just a subdivision as a whole. Us being without that, I don't know I don't think it's going to hurt us at all, but just from a trend standpoint, and then I'm older, so I'm, in that kind of 55 and over in the early stages of that. And we're definitely, we look at those type of communities and get really excited about it. So I think those amenities where you have aged people, interest, et cetera, I do think that's becoming popular for sure.
Absolutely. Well, Phil, I want to thank you again for taking time to speak with us and join us on the podcast today. It's been super interesting hearing about Harmony Grove and your experience. Anything else that you'd like to close on here before we end the discussion for the day?
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully I gave you some information just to help with anyone that's looking to manage a new HOA or issues that are out there. It's a good job. I enjoy it being president of the HOA, but it definitely is work. I think, that's one of the challenges with managing an HOA is, keeping an interested board. And, when you see the interest kind of waning, that's okay, because people have a natural tendency to I've done this for 3 years, I want to move on. And you just have to be on the lookout for that and sort of stay ahead of it, finding new board members that have a new zest for it. So that's, one of the things to think about. But I appreciate the time today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Phil, again. And thank you, Michelle. And with that, we will close it out. Take care.
Thanks.